the first mover advantage is gigantic in Bitcoin, even from a country's perspective. Even watching what El Salvador is doing, they're just this little unknown, country that's just making all the right moves early on. And so it's fascinating to watch. And that's another thing. I don't know if we should even dip into that, but I think Bitcoin changes the geopolitical world order in a meaningful way. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with the sovereign individual, that whole concept, but I think that history tends to move in these sort of 500 to 1,000 year blocks or cycles. And I think that we have had this transition, a clear transition from the analog age to the digital age, the microprocessor, internet, and now Bitcoin, which is the internet of value age. And I think it has geopolitical implications. Most of the traditional finance people that I follow still believe in the ascendancy of China and the descendancy of the US, and that it's setting up to have a lot of tensions and things. The dark horse is Bitcoin, literally coming out of nowhere. And I think it's going to just change everything. And so anyways, that's a whole different topic and we don't have to go down that route. But
let's dive into it a little bit.
Okay.
Since you brought it up, because it is very interesting. I mean, how do you think that the world will change, and why do you think that China might not be a global superpower that a lot of people might expect?
Sure. So I think it's definitely on the path to become one in many ways, and it's following the playbook, right? It's like literally looking at history and looking at France and the Netherlands, and it's looking at England, and it's looking at the US and looking at all these great countries from the past, Spain, and saying, okay, here's what you got to do. You need to stockpile assets, especially gold, and in these days, like oil. So let's get some hard assets, and then we're going to build a sound money based on these assets. And while these other countries are awash in their own debt, like the United States is, and these massive debt to GDP ratios, they can't help but decline because of that. And so we're going to come in with this sound commodity-based currency, and we're going to come in and ascend, and it follows. And Ray Dalio goes into this at length and talks about the kind of rise and falls of these huge sovereign nations. Why is it changing? I think because of the whole decentralization movement. So because of the internet and because of Bitcoin, basically people are able to spread the power out. So what we have seen, I think, in the US, I think will go down in history as the peak of monolithic power. They had the hugest, largest, most unassailable monopoly on violence that the world has ever seen. So they can control the world, like literally the flows of the world, geopolitical flows, economic flows. They own the nation, they own the navies of the world. They control the movements in the seas and commerce and all this kind of stuff. They still do, but it's starting to come apart a little bit. And we're trying to maintain that status on borrowed money. These other nations, the BRICS nations, have caught on to that. I think they caught on about 10 years ago and have started making changes. And the easiest one is they're not buying treasuries really anymore, and they're stockpiling gold and oil. Smart move, I would say. In the old playbook, that's a smart move. But I think what they're not recognizing and what all of these countries are missing literally is Bitcoin and the whole concept of decentralization. When you don't control the printing press anymore, you don't have the power. Whoever controls the creation and distribution of money literally has the most power. If you have the most monetary units and the creation and distribution of it, like the US does, even though it's starting to wane, you have just almost unlimited power. As more and more humans take that purchasing power out of these fiat systems and into Bitcoin, it goes into this distributed network. I think of it like this meshwork that basically envelops the earth and that benefits humans at the expense of the government. So while government's trying to draw your purchasing power into them and to get bigger and stronger ever more, which is what the US has done a great job doing over the last 80 years or so. Bitcoin is basically sucking that back out and distributing it back out to the people. So I think we're just going to see an entirely different geopolitical world. The whole world order is going to look differently because we're not going to see centralized monoliths of power that have the ability to destroy the entire world, because of their nuclear arsenals or whatever means that they have. Bitcoin, I think, and this is Jason Lowery is very, people love to hate him. He has, popular and unpopular opinions. I think he's right with this. Like the way that the geopolitical world order has held for the last 5 centuries is mutually assured destruction, right? And I think Bitcoin changes that. Basically, it's that mutually assured preservation that Bitcoin causes. Basically, it's like, you can't get my Bitcoin and my value and our net worth and our purchasing power, but we can't get yours either. And so it sort of creates these natural barriers, and there's really no reason to go attack another nation if we can't get their value and give it to ourselves. It's not possible technically. So that's something that Bitcoin does. I think it actually has the possibility to usher in basically multiple centuries of peace, which is surprising, especially for those of us who grew up, with grandparents and great-grandparents that were involved in these world wars. We all thought the world was going to end and that World War III was coming, and that at some point nukes were going to go off and, we had the potential to blow up most or all of the world. I think Bitcoin is literally able to change that, and it's because of that distribution of power and that mutually assured preservation throughout the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I definitely think Bitcoin leaves room for optimism for the world and for humanity. So I think it's a great thing. Hopefully we're right about that.
Definitely.
I kind of want to talk a little bit about like individual portfolio construction, like thinking about wealth from just a normal person's perspective, and obviously not financial advice or anything, but how do you think that someone should think about their Bitcoin allocation and their personal portfolio?
It's a good question. So, I've been doing this for this is my 11th year now of managing other people's money and running a hedge fund. It's very different for everybody. And I tell people regarding Bitcoin, they all want to know, like, what's the right percentage? And I tell people the more you understand Bitcoin, the more you know Bitcoin, the more Bitcoin you will own. And that's been true basically across the board for many, many years. I've seen people do that. So people start with, right, I see there's 4 phases of Bitcoin understanding. The initial one is basically skepticism. You mock it. You don't believe it. You think it's for crazy people. You believe all the FUD that you see in the newspapers and all that kind of stuff. The second is you finally kind of come around and you see all these people making money and getting wealthier. So you turn into a speculator, right? So you start thinking of it like a trade. It's all the crypto bros are kind of in that category. Like they just think, when do I get in? When do I get out? And I'm going to, take my profits here and blah, blah, blah. And then you go a step further, step 3, I think, is you see Bitcoin as either an investment or a hedge. So like just an investment in general. And that's kind of how Wall Street has started to understand it. Like it's an actual asset class that you could invest in. And I think the SEC approval of the spot Bitcoin ETF sort of confirmed that. So lots of Wall Streeters are starting to see this, and even baby boomers are seeing this as an alternative asset class. That's a new asset class to invest in. Lots of other people talk about it as a hedge too. I think of that in that same third category. The traditional fiat system the Keynesian economic system is getting really precarious. Debt is getting out of control. We're starting to see nations have real issues. People are struggling with inflation. The cost of goods and services are really increasing. Bitcoin is a hedge. It's an alternative system to the fiat system. In case it explodes and dies or implodes or whatever happens to a fiat system when it dies, especially the US-based huge economic system, at least I have Bitcoin as a hedge in case it does, kind of like gold, they think of it. And then fourth and final, I think you see Bitcoin as superior savings technology. So I tell people I get asked all the time, well, when are you going to take profits? So, we talked earlier about these parabolic move higher. Like, what if Bitcoin gets up to 400,000 or 5? Are you going to take profits then? And it's just I think when you think of Bitcoin as savings, it's really funny. Nobody ever comes up to me and says, hey, when are you going to take profits on your bank savings account? You're just like, what are you even talking about? Right. It's just my cash in the bank. I use that to pay my bills and to, if I need to buy a car or something or go on a vacation, that's what I use my savings for. And so I think of Bitcoin as the same way. Not only is it like a bank savings account, which ironically is where your purchasing power goes to die, it's superior savings technology. It's appreciating store of value, and it appreciates your purchasing power. So I would argue that most people would be wise to think of it like Michael Saylor does. You just buy it. It's the king of assets. What are you going to exchange it for? Even if you do make a good trade, there's a good chance you'll time it wrong. You'll get taxed a bunch. You could lose something and you'll end up with less Bitcoin than you did if you would have just, kept your head down and stacked sats and put it into cold storage, like a humble pleb. So I can't even remember the original question, but the amount of Bitcoin in a portfolio. It depends on the person. And I will say that what I've seen is people get off 0. That's the biggest move. Just get off 0%, have some sort of Bitcoin allocation. And when you see the effects that has on your portfolio, that it's not nearly as scary as you thought it was going to be. And you're seeing some pretty nice portfolio gains because of it. People start to increase it. And then as you study Bitcoin itself and the network itself and the monetary properties and the scheduled halvings and all of these things that are just amazing about Bitcoin, you start to realize that it's not even risky. All the FUD that people talk about is really unlikely to happen, right? The governments aren't going to shut it down. It's not boiling the oceans. It's all this kind of crazy things that people talk about doesn't actually ever really come to pass. And so you realize that the real risk in finance is not volatility, even though that's what people associate with risk. That's what they teach you in your MBA finance courses. Real risk, I would argue, is the chance of losing your purchasing power over time in a given asset. So I would argue that even though the 10-year treasury is considered the world's risk-free asset, that it actually is exceedingly risky because you're almost guaranteed to lose your purchasing power if you hold it for the 10-year duration. That's risky. If you have less purchasing power 10 years from now, you did something wrong, I would argue. And Bitcoin does the opposite of that. So even though it's volatile, I think it's very unrisky.
Is there